For most, discipline is a virtue. For Sparta, it was a law written into the bones. In the gray light before dawn, infants were weighed and watched as if they were bundles of raw material to be assessed, not children to be cradled. In the shadow of that image lies a harder truth. What made Sparta feared on the battlefield was a social machine that transformed families into factories of warriors. Forget the glossy tales of heroism. The story here is colder and more mechanical. At its heart was a set of statutes and rituals that treated reproduction, childhood, and loyalty as components in an engineered solution to keep the state powerful. Marriage was protocol, not romance. Midwives and magistrates inspected newborns with the same clinical eye used to examine armor. The air smelled of sweat and oil, the stone tasted of dust, and voices of elders carried like metronomes in a courtyard of waiting parents. The conflict was simple and brutal: communal efficiency or human tenderness. The state chose efficiency. We will lay bare the procedures, the ceremonies, and the costs. By the end, you will see how a system that forged unmatched warriors also hollowed out the society that needed them. How did the city that prized the living shield end up paying with its most intimate bonds? The machine of Sparta was not a metaphor, it was legislative. Records and fragments of laws, later commentators and inscriptions point to formal edicts administered by councils of elders and ephors that regulated who could marry, who could keep children, and who would be exposed. Magistrate Polycles speaks in later accounts as if quoting minutes when he describes councils convened to determine bloodlines and fitness. The assembly set statutes that defined eligibility for land, for military service, and for citizenship, with clauses about offspring, kinship, and public duty. These regulations were communicated through ritual proclamations at communal feasts and inscribed decrees posted in the agora. A practical example existed in the case of Cleon, a landholder whose son was judged under a clause about limb strength. The reaction among neighbors ranged from silent nods to whispered outrage, but public opinion mattered less than the calculation of survival. The council framed its decisions as rational and ancestral, citing precedents and invoking the names of forebears in voices that brooked no dissent. In effect, the law converted family life into a set of metrics and thresholds to be met. The machinery required functionaries, the midwives, the senior warriors, the instructors, and the elders who became nodes in a network of enforcement. The system was explained in clinical terms at the time as population management, and in later scholarship as proto-eugenics enacted for military advantage. The rhetoric used words like purity and robustness, while the instruments were nails and weights and judgment seats. The social reaction was varied. Some families, like that of Thalia, accepted the logic, believing survival trumped personal grief. Others hid infants, lied about births, or bribed inspectors. That gray economy became another official duty carried by veteran Nestor and trainer like Chion, who patrolled villages to ensure compliance. We will show how these laws were not abstract, but operational procedures performed daily and ritualistically. Women were not peripheral to the system, they were central. The state defined womanhood by reproductive capacity and physical resilience, and then trained bodies to fit that definition. Women such as Thalia were exercised in public courses, measured for hip breadth, and instructed in a dozen techniques meant to improve childbirth outcomes. The rhetoric insisted that strength of the mother equaled strength of the city. Training for women included running, wrestling, and endurance tasks performed beside men during communal festivals. This was not mere spectacle, it was social conditioning. Midwife Hegia taught specific breathing and lifting methods designed to reduce complications and to produce infants deemed likely to survive hardship. At the same time, ideology reconfigured affection into duty. Mothers were encouraged to view emotional attachment as a potential liability to collective cohesion. Testimonials from later poets record how mothers learned to present children to inspection with faces that betrayed hope and practiced neutrality.
Sensory details in these settings are sharp. The smell of olive oil on skin, the rasp of coarse linen against limbs, the metallic clink of measuring scales, the hollow echo of courtyards filled with tense waiting. The political justification was blunt: survivalism. Elders argued that forging robust bodies and steady minds outweighed private grief. Public schooling for girls and women became an instrument to align private bodies with public needs. The moment of birth became a tribunal. In a dim birthing chamber, elders, a midwife, and a representative of the council convened to assess the newborn. The room smelled of herbal smoke and warmed stone, the air heavy with the sound of a lamp guttering. Hegia placed the infant on a prepared slab, and the magistrate, Polycles, tapped ribs and ankles with practiced hands. Dialogue in that room is preserved in fragments and must be reconstructed, but imagine this exchange to feel the human tension. Hegia says, "Please hold him gently, he is small." Polycles replies, "Strength is what matters, not small comforts." Thalia pleads, "He has my father's eyes, he will be strong." Polycles counters, "Eyes do not carry weight in battle." Nestor interjects, "We test the knees now." Lycaon says, "If he fails, we set him aside." Thalia begs, "Is there no mercy? Is there no reprieve?" Polycles answers, "Mercy would betray the city." Hegia whispers, "There are ways to hide him." Polycles warns, "Hiding is a crime." This sequence of voices compresses the procedural logic and the private grief into a tight pressure chamber. The inspection itself follows a predictable technique in which the infant is examined for limb symmetry, skin tone, respiratory vigor, and reflexes. The method is simple and brutal, a checklist applied by trained hands in a matter of minutes. Technical procedures for inspection and selection were specific and repeatable. Inspectors used the standard sequence to evaluate infants and children, a scale for weight, a set of manual manipulations of joints, observation of cry, reflexes, and an anatomical checklist that included chest depth, limb proportion, and respiratory strength. The process was documented by elders in ledgers, and the decisions recorded with terse notations that permitted audits and appeals in rare cases. The language used in these protocols was clinical and categorical and aimed to reduce subjectivity through ritual repetition. The agoge was the engine that turned boys into warriors and society into a machine. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and placed into communal barracks where the curriculum was deprivation, discipline, competition, and music that taught rhythm of march and silence. For Archidemus, the protagonist who serves as our lens, this separation was the first rupture in a life that would be defined by other ruptures. His backstory begins in a coastal village where his mother Thalia taught him to swim and his father Cleon fished. As a child, Archidemus loved small things: the curve of a shell, the smell of seaweed, and the taste of figs stolen under a fig tree. At 7, the state took him, and he learned that affection had to be rationed, and nostalgia was a dangerous indulgence. In training, he discovered a competitive streak and a capacity to endure cold that surprised even his instructors. He had a teacher named Nestor, who favored blunt counsel, and a friend Lycaon, who laughed easily despite the strictness. Later, as a teenager, Archidemus lost his brother to an inspection that removed a sibling for being deemed brittle. The loss taught him that loyalty to the group could be a cloak for cruelty. He grew into a man whose chest bore scars and whose voice seldom softened. The present sees Archidemus as a veteran and instructor, torn between defense of his city and memory of what it cost him. These paragraphs sketch the human core behind systemic narrative and explain why individuals both enforce and mourn the machine that made them. The training environment was sensory-rich and punishing. The air was always dusty with sand and ash, sweat salted the lips, and the thud of feet on packed earth made a constant tempo. The fabric of their tunics chafed like rough rope, the metallic tang of bronze from weapons lingered on palms, and the smell of leather filled their sleep. At night, hunger was a teacher, and cold a test. The instructors used mock duels, public humiliation, and endurance runs to erase individual softness and create a predictable soldierly temperament. Conversations in barracks are functional and repetitive, and the script of exchange is part of the conditioning. Here is a typical scene, with 8 exchanges to show rhythm and power. Nestor asks, "Who skipped drills?" The boy answers, "Not me." Nestor replies, "Stand forward." Lysander says, "I saw you lagging." Archidamus says, "We were tired." Nestor counters, "Tired is not an excuse." Lysander insists, "You must."
Archidamus admits, "I failed." Nestor says, "Fail and you become nothing." Lysander offers, "We will help you." Nestor concludes, "The city forgives weakness if it is corrected." This pattern encodes hierarchy and mutual policing. Rituals of proving were public and ceremonial and functioned as performances of the state. Young men were tested on obstacles, on endurance marches, on wrestling rings in front of assembled peers and elders. They ran with sandbags, were exposed to simulated injuries, and were forced to demonstrate restraint in staged cruelty tests that measured reaction under pressure. The sensory archive of these events is vivid. The rasp of shouted orders, the smell of milk and iron, the sting of salt on bruised skin, the weight of the hoplite shield pressed into shoulder, the cold grit of the soil under bare feet. The rhetoric framed pain as proof, and the crowd learned to applaud stoic faces. Testimony from Archidamus recalls his first public exam and the exact burn of rope on his palms and the smell of smoke from a nearby bonfire as he lifted a heavy wooden shield until his arms shook. Some passed with honor, others were publicly shamed or expelled into inferior classes, a process that reinforced status and obedience. There were moments when the crowd cheered death as meaning, and the young heard in that cheer the voice of the state itself. The operationalization of terror was explicit in small units that enforced compliance beyond ceremony. A cadre of young men received orders from commanders like Leonidas to execute expulsions, patrol intercepts, and public punishments. Orders came with legal cover. The council issued mandates that justified violence as maintenance of order and survival. Dialogue among commanders can be crude and utilitarian. Leonidas states, "We clear the village tonight." Eurytus asks, "What will we do if they resist?" Leonidas answers, "We do what has always worked." Eurytus says, "Will the magistrate be satisfied?" Leonidas replies, "The magistrate expects results." Eurytus counters, "And conscience?" Leonidas laughs, "Conscience is for softer cities." This exchange shows how bureaucratic orders and personal explanations blended into a doctrine that sealed terrible acts as administrative chores. Enforcement units kept ledgers, documented operations, and reported back in formal registers describing numbers removed and cases adjudicated. The return of warriors into adult reproduction completed the loop, but it was not a return to tenderness. Marriages were often ritual alliances, and women like Thalia were repositioned as mothers of warriors, expected to produce heirs rather than companions. The social choreography of weddings was ceremonial, the bed was presented in public, and fertility was a civic duty. The veterans carried the language of the agoge into family life, favoring discipline over intimacy. The children of warriors inherited rights and responsibilities, and the cycle continued. Some veterans found solace in the ritual of training new recruits and in public status. Others felt a hollowing in private rooms when silence replaced conversation. The state thus ensured continuity of bodies while eroding private culture. Tension arises. The midwife hides a child and then faces exposure. She wrestles with memory, duty, and complicity, and the choice becomes moral and existential. The second tension centers on a failed inspection of an entire cohort where an epidemic exposes the fragility of rigid selection and forces elders to reconsider their criteria. The third tension is a battlefield reversal, where the rigidly trained army meets an adaptive foe, and the very discipline that forged them becomes a handicap. Each of these moments unfolds as internal conflict, memory flashback, and a consequential decision that reshapes the narrative. The midwife, Hegia, hides a newborn under a pile of blankets to spare it from inspection. She remembers her own loss, and the touch of the infant makes her hands shake. Her memory pulls her back to a night when she could not save another child.
The decision to hide the baby is both betrayal and mercy. She must choose to protect at the risk of punishment. The elders discover the absence and interrogate her in a courtyard filled with morning light. The scene is intimate and public at once. She speaks softly, "I could not be instrument of death." They say, "You broke law." She answers, "I preserved life." The moral calculus reverberates through the community. An epidemic sweeps through a cohort marked as exemplary. The inspectors realize their measures did not account for contagious weakness. The elders convene to debate whether the selection protocols need revision. The conversation is technical and charged with fear. The council weighs demographic numbers, resource calculations, and military readiness before deciding whether to relax some criteria. The tension is between short-term survival and long-term adaptation. The debate reveals the inflexibility of a system built to eliminate variation. On the field, a disciplined unit trained to obey orders meets a foe that uses surprise and adaptation. The Spartan formation holds but cannot adjust to swift maneuvers. The commanders face a sudden need to improvise. The veterans recall rituals of obedience, while some younger soldiers propose unconventional tactics. A rift forms between tradition and innovation. The result is costly and instructive. The defeat is not merely a loss, it is evidence that a machine that optimizes for one environment loses resilience in another. Why did this system collapse? The decline was not sudden, it was cumulative. Demographic strain, followed by social rigidity and economic shifts. Over generations, the emphasis on a narrow set of traits reduced the pool of eligible citizens, while the costs of sustaining privileged warrior households rose. Inflexible practices that discouraged trade and cultural exchange made adaptation slow. A decisive battle, often cited in accounts, saw a coalition exploit mobility and supply networks that Sparta did not prioritize. Veterans returned to find fields fallow and households thin. The populace could not replenish its ranks as birth rates fell and costly wars continued. The state struggled to reconcile tradition with necessity, and in the end, the very discipline that secured victories also limited capacity to innovate. Epilogue. 1 month later, the immediate administrative response is visible. The council issues emergency decrees to redistribute land and open new marriage eligibility rules. The chroniclers record petitions from families, and the streets show more faces than before. The tempo of daily life changes, markets see new activity, and the training barracks recruit from a broader pool. There is unease, but also a pragmatic pivot. The elderly record the changes with mixed relief and sorrow as ritual frequency is reduced and some festivals are repurposed toward production. 1 month captures shock and the first signs of policy shift. 3 months later, social effects are measurable. Demographic registers show tentative increases in births among newly eligible households. Agricultural output stabilizes with redistributed labor, and merchant routes bring different goods and ideas. The military adapts by incorporating auxiliary units trained in mobility and scouting. The cultural landscape shifts as poets and teachers question old scripts. Public conversations become less monolithic, and dissenting voices like that of philosopher Dorian gain audible space. The narrative of inviolable ritual softens, and the city learns to tolerate debate. 3 months marks early experimentation and the slow loosening of rigid norms. 6 months out, the transformation is more evident. Institutions have reframed training curricula, trade agreements expand, and marriages are increasingly negotiated for mutual benefit rather than strict lineage. The veterans teach technique and resilience, not simply obedience. The economy shows signs of recovery and the mortality curves improve, while civic rituals retain memory but lose absolutism. The moral ledger is mixed. There are families who grieve old losses and others who celebrate new children. The lesson endures. Public memory records that an obsession with purity and immediate military optimization produced short-term gains and long-term fragility. Yet, the adaptation demonstrates that social machines can be corrected when incentives align and voices inside the city push for change. In the end, the story of Sparta as an experiment in social engineering is not only about brutality. It is about choices and trade-offs. The city forged warriors of unmatched discipline and paid with a narrowing of its human fabric. That history forces a question on us. What price are we willing to pay for security in our own time? If this account unsettles you, write one line in the comments starting with I to tell us how you would choose between communal survival and private compassion. Your responses help us understand how a modern audience interprets these ancient dilemmas and guide future episodes. If you want more careful reconstructions and expert-grounded analysis, subscribe and join the conversation. We will continue to follow the lives of people like Archidamus, Thalia, Hegia, Polycles, Leonidas, and Lycaon to show how institutions, bodies, minds, and legacies